during these difficult times we find ourselves in, I'm reminded of the book of Ruth. Ruth in the Old Testament records a time that was very challenging. It was the end of the period of the Judges, which was a low point in the history of Israel. And it in particular talks about a famine that arose in the land. And a man named Elimelech, who lived in Bethlehem, took his wife Ruth and his two sons to Moab to flee the famine. And that was not something he was supposed to do. God had said that he would provide for his people, and they were not to leave the land in cases of famine. They were to trust God. But nevertheless, Elimelech disobeyed God. He ran away. And in Moab, he died. And his two sons both married Moabite women. And then they also died, leaving only Naomi, Elimelech's widow, and the two Moabite women who now were also widowed. It's hard for us to appreciate the difficulty that would have been, but in that day to have no men left in the family, neither husbands nor sons nor fathers, would be to be destitute, to be without resources completely. It would be like you being dropped into the slum of Nairobi, Kenya, not knowing the language. You have no money, you have no passport, you have nothing. You're without resources. That was their situation. What's interesting to me is to notice the names of these main characters and what they mean. So Elimelech means God is king, and yet he dies. It seems to be a bit of a mockery. It's like the reign of God is dead. And I think to some people it must have felt like that in the midst of the famine. Naomi means pleasant, yet it seemed as if her life was anything but pleasant. Bethlehem, the place where they were from, that they fled from because of the famine, means house of bread. You see the irony in that name. These names almost seem to be a mocking of their circumstances. And yet, by the end of the story, we find that those names were actually entirely accurate. God is king. That's what Elimelech means. And we see through the circumstances of this story how by chapter 4, the end of the book, Ruth, the Moabite daughter-in-law of Naomi, has married another man, Boaz. And they have a child who ends up being a grandfather of King David of Israel. So God is king. He is ruling. He is in charge of things. Naomi, whose life means pleasant and whose life seemed to be anything but, ends up in a very pleasant place due to God's provision for her and Ruth through this marriage to Boaz. And Bethlehem ends up being a house of bread. And Ruth goes back in the story itself, and she is able to be cared for. There's sufficient bread both for her and for her mother-in-law, Naomi. And even more than that, Bethlehem, as you may know, is the town where our Lord Jesus, the bread of life, has come from. It is the house of bread. So let these truths remind you of the big truth, the great truth, that God is in control. And when circumstances might seem to be mocking his control of things, remember that the story is not over yet. And when it is over, it will be revealed quite clearly that God is in charge, that he loves you, and He will provide for you abundantly. Be encouraged with these words today.